So you're looking at stable isotopes of carbon and nitrogen, and these things have a systematic relationship to an animal's ecology, what it's eating and the type of life it lives. You have samples from the past in this general place, in this general time, including this one human sample that we'll dig into, but a bunch of other animals, saber-toothed tigers, mammoths, small animals, a bunch of stuff. And you can sort of plot this stable isotope data out, and you get nice clean clustering, or there's an orderly relationship between what the animal was eating, the type of life it led, and where it falls on this map. And so then you can put the human sample on that and just ask, okay, does it look more like a saber-toothed cat? Does it look more like a mammoth? Does it look more like this, that, or the other animal? And that's gonna tell you something about what the human diet was. And the punchline that you just gave us was, when you do that type of analysis using these stable isotopes, the diet of this Clovis individual appears to be a lot like something like a saber-toothed cat, as opposed to something more omnivorous like a bear or some other type of creature.
Right, and it's definitely not an omnivore.
Mm.
An omnivore would appear, because it eats plants and animals in more or less equal proportions, like a bear,
Mm-hmm.
a black bear. It would appear between the hypercarnivores, like lions and saber-toothed cats, and the plant eaters, like
Mm-hmm.
horses and bison,
Yeah.
camel. And what happened with the Anzick child's mother is the Anzick child mother ended up next to that hypercarnivore scimitar cat,
Mm-hmm.
nowhere near where a bear would be.
Mm-hmm.
So
And we know
definitely
independently.
not a generalized forager.
Yeah. So not only is it landing in the part of the graph where all the other carnivore data points are, but I think you guys mentioned that the saber-toothed cat, the closest point to the human sample, we know independently that this animal was specialized for mammoth consumption in particular.
Right.
Yeah, the morphology of the dentition is the key, and also the isotope signature. It maps on directly to mammoth. But I want to back up a little bit. That's we look at that as an additional line of evidence. Where do
Mm-hmm.
they map out with other secondary consumers? The most important, of course, is where does the diet plot out relative to the suites of animals that are in the area in the time period of question.
Mm-hmm.
And that, of course, is the key issue. We can generate percentages for, again, heavy mammoth diet. There's a lot of elk, which is interesting. We don't see a lot of elk at the time, but that's because elk is coming into that region along with Clovis individuals from the north. It's a
Mm.
ranging animal, and we see them coming at roughly the same time. And we have elk antler at the Anzick site itself. So that's great independent confirmation that elk was a major component of the diet as well, as was bison and probably a little camel, but mostly bison as well. So basically mammoth first, cervus or elk, then bison, and then horse was at a much lower level.
Mm-hmm. But they're
Horse
killing
not
they're
at all.
killing big herbivores, and they're trying to get the most bang for their buck. So naturally, the mammoth is probably the most bang for their buck.
Definitely the most bang for their buck. Yes, you could have the whole family, probably several families, if we take our indication from the Laprelle mammoth kill down in southern Wyoming, where they had three separate little camps around this one kill. So you could feed your entire community for a month, 2 months, whatever on that one animal. So it's a lot of food as long as you
Mm-hmm.
keep it from spoiling.
And it's not just the protein; it's the fat. So, hunter
Yeah.
gatherers, that's one of the key nutrients that need to be getting enough fat in their diet. Super high energy rich resource, and of course, these are not going to be coming from plants. That can be coming
Right.
from animals, and particularly big animals. So, and I also want to stress that we're not saying they didn't eat plants. So they definitely ate plants. We have berries and this sort of thing. But as Jim mentioned, it's just not equivalent. It's not like something where it's a lot of plants
Yeah.
would be typical for a generalist forager to be incorporated into their diet.
Yeah. There's no evidence that they were eating what a modern person would intuitively call a balanced diet. They were probably eating a little bit of whatever they could, but they were indexing very, very, very high on the meat and the fat from these large-bodied herbivorous mammals.
They were eating a keto diet,
Yeah, yeah, that's
or
what I
a
was going to go
carnivore
next.
diet in the modern dietary terminology.
Yeah. So most of
Uh,
their energy was coming from fat rather than carbohydrate, presumably.
Carbohydrates from fats and from protein. I
Oh,
mean,
okay.
your body can break down protein and turn it into energy as well.
Yeah.
In fact, that's what it
A
does
good analog.
with your own body. If you run out of food, you're starting to feed on your own tissues.
Yeah, a good analog is when we, the question, one of the sort of the people on the other side would say is, oh, we don't really see a lot of foragers, just eating meat. And of course, the answer is, of course we do. You don't have to go very far for where I sit in Alaska. Inuit peoples and Paleo-Inuit peoples regularly utilize majorly meat diets, either caribou or seal, whaling, walrus. That's the major component, and plants make up a much lower portion of the diet up here. So we certainly see plenty of evidence in the recent past of this kind of a diet. Of course, the animals are totally different in the
Yeah.
past.
Yeah. And of course, presumably people would have eaten things, season, like if berries are there for a part of the season, you can, presumably you're just, yeah, you're going to pluck some when they're there.
Yeah.
But the main food supply really did seem to be these big animals. And it is similar to what we see in more recent populations. It sounds like, for example, the Inuit, they're eating what's available season to season, but most of what's available most of the time are animals of different kinds.
Yeah, peoples of the Great Plains lived that way too.
Mm.
And they were getting the majority of their food supply from bison.
Mm-hmm.
From bison fat and bison meat. They would pound it, dry it and pound it with berries, but the quantity of berries they were able to extract from their environment is probably nowhere near sufficient for to be a majority of their diet.
Yeah, and I had a gentleman named Eugene Morin, I think, on some months ago on the podcast, and we were talking about Paleolithic diets and things like that. And one thing he really emphasized is that in a lot of these populations, like the Inuit, yes, they're eating the meat, they're eating the protein, but they really, really prize the fat on the animal in a way that we often can't appreciate today. Like if I go to a restaurant with my family, a lot of people will cut the fat off their steak, but he basically said, no. In these settings back then, they wanted all of that fat. They really prized it.
Yeah, if you're eating steak, the higher the fat content, the tastier it's going to be. That's part of human evolution. We really require that in the past, and we sought out all sorts of ways to get that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Ben works in Alaska, and he knows how much fat you want when you're working outdoors in Alaska. I spent one season up in the Aleutian Islands where it never stops raining and the wind never stops blowing and it doesn't get above 50 degrees most days. And we would practically fight over the foods with the most fat in them. So it's a big deal when you're needing to work with that. But you look at the keto diet that people go on, and they're keeping carbohydrates out of the diet. They're shifting to metabolizing fat. And they're seeking, in some cases, to metabolize their own fat, but their diet is predominantly protein and fat, and they do fine on that.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I've learned recurrently in different ways on the podcast, talking to all sorts of different people, is that our body is very capable of switching between ketosis and glucose metabolism. We're essentially built for it, so to speak. There's a lot of evidence now that ketone bodies like BHB have various benefits. And basically the general inference that I make, and I think a lot of other people make, is that at least intermittently, peoples of the past were probably very commonly going into and potentially even staying in ketosis for extended periods of time. And so our body is in some sense adapted to it.
Right. I mean, clearly we're capable of shifting between the two. I think that probably the glucose metabolism basis might be a much more recent development in our evolution.
As a consequence of agriculture, presumably.
And yes, post-agriculture.
Yeah.
I mean, where many of us aren't capable of digesting a lot of the materials that come out of grains.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
For example, particularly glucose, or not glucose, Gluten, thank you. Gluten intolerant folks and lactose intolerant folks. I mean, there are people who aren't capable of digesting the materials that are commonly in our diets today. So why would we expect that our ancestors who had not yet evolved the capability of using those nutrients weren't fundamentally different from ourselves in terms of their dietary needs?
I want to ask you a little bit more about the individual you studied. So where exactly was the sample taken from? And I think you mentioned that this was a small child, 18-month-old. But when you're plotting the data, you're talking about the mother of the child. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, yeah, the child was 18 months old. So based on what we know about hunter-gatherer behavior, hunter-gatherers are usually nursing their children at least partially until they're 3.5 to 4 years old.
Mm.
So and that's been found to be true among not only modern hunter-gatherers, but also ancient hunter-gatherer populations. It's not until you get into the Neolithic that you start seeing much younger weaning times in agricultural populations. So what we're reading actually is in large part the mother's body in looking at the child's stable isotopes.
Because the child would have been getting most of its
himself.
food in the form of breast milk.
Not his food supply. We're looking at her food supply.
Got it.
And given his age, we calculated that he was about 1/3 auxiliary foods and 2/3 mama, and computed on that basis. And what it showed was that Anzick's mom was heavy into the mammoth.
Yeah, so far and away, mammoth was number one, and then the secondary, the second and third ranked things were other large-bodied mammals that you mentioned. So things like a bison and elk, I think you said.
Yeah, so 96% of the protein diet was megafauna in some form or another. So I mean that by any stretch is a megafaunal specialist, and I think that's definitively demonstrated by this study. The secondary one sort of varies. Cervus is always high, so elk is always the second highest among the different models we did, which makes sense if we have multiple elk antler foreshafts that were found directly with the burial. And then bison was next. This matches broadly the faunal record, where bison were really common elements in these sort of these campsites, and horse was lower than the other ones. Horse was roughly 10% or so. Yeah.
And so I guess on the one hand, your data is quite definitive in the sense that it's not very subtle. It's not like the data point was like in the middle and you can kind
of. It was
a hammer. It was pretty clearly
not subtle.
The diet looked like a saber-toothed cat. It wasn't even like a bear. On the other hand, we're talking about one sample here. So how would people argue about that?
Well, it's important to take into account that when you take a random sample of a single member of any population, the probability is that will be a normal individual, not a member of an extreme. This is the only individual we have. Consequently, it's the only data point we're going to get, at least unless we find a lot more people and modern sensibilities about ancient skeletons change. So it's the one we have. But I don't want to emphasize, I can't emphasize enough that you expect a single individual to be representative, not to be outside the norm.
And back then, the variance person to person was presumably much less, just because
much less. You would expect it to be much less, and considering the fact that Clovis looks the same everywhere you see it, and that when you find food bone in Clovis sites, mammoth dominates.
Yeah, so it all
bison is secondary. We don't see elk very much because elk are not really widespread in the environment yet. At that time, they're still just moving in. They're just coming into the country along with the people.
And that strikes me as informative in itself, because if elk are not that common there yet, and yet they show up as a highly ranked food here, that means that they were really focusing on them, because they weren't just randomly sampling from whatever was available.
Well, they were getting them in their neighborhood. Elk was available, and the fact that was one of the strongest things about that finding was we had elk show up as a secondary food supply in each of the tests we ran, and the elk antlers were with the child. I mean, those pieces, that set of evidence is like matching the scimitar cat in its quality of in its meaning, in the impact. When you look at Clovis in general, the behavior is that of a highly mobile predator. And when we look at the sources of stone tool materials, you often find stone tools that come from sources hundreds of miles away.
Mm.
And we're not expecting that those tools are being used over years of time. They're probably being used more likely, 1 to 2 years or a month before you have to change out and get new ones.
Yeah, yeah. So
Or you're going to,
you not only have specialization to eat animals like this, but people are moving around a lot. So they
moving
are
around a
the
lot.
opposite of sedentary.
Exactly, exactly. They're not sedentary. So that high mobility is, you take that high mobility and you look at the range of mobility of the mammoths that the team Ben's been working with has been looking at in Alaska. And not only did they seem to move seasonally from place to place over large distances, sometimes they just shift completely and move to another landscape a
Hmm.
long distance away.
Mhm.
So if you have an animal that behaves that way, it's easy to see a human population that's been sort of migrating along with the mammoths, simply taking that great big leap and going off into a new landscape.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
everything about the record seems to say the same thing.
I really want to hit on that because I think that's there's been a very positive response to the article within the community. I think the only issue that I've seen raised is it's a sample size of one. Yeah, it seems to support our contention, but I want to look at it a couple different ways. So, one, this is the first test. This is the first direct test of these two ideas. So these are
Hmm.
the two competing ideas,
Yeah.
and unequivocally, rigorously, clearly, it came down on the side of the Clovis as a megafaunal specialist. It could have been the other way.
Yeah.
To the
Or
point that
or anywhere in the middle, right?
or it could have been like a mushy middle. Yeah. So
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
fact that it came down so strongly with multiple lines of evidence, as we said, this is clear. This is rigorous and confirmed. The other issue, how far can we push this? Well, clearly, I mean, Jim highlighted some of these issues, but it bears sort of dialing down and looking at the details. So we understand hunter-gatherers share food. This is one thing that we certainly understand about hunter-gatherer ecology is that you're constantly sharing food. So the idea that this person would be an anomaly, something on the extreme, beyond the fact that it's randomly pulled from this
Yeah.
population,
Be
that's
very, very
also
unusual.
unlikely to be the case. Number one. The second issue that Jim mentioned, this homogeneous culture, this is a lifeway that's very much connected and tracked with moving with large mammal herds. You, and this is not just one site. This is many, many sites. This is dozens and dozens of sites where we see this relationship. And then the fauna remains really is the key. The fact that when they're preserved, this is proboscideans have the largest MNI, the minimum number of individuals we can track from these sites, on the order of like in the 90s. This is a large amount of meat in a proportion. When you look at edible biomass, it dwarfs any of the other sort of elements in their diet, even if they were eating rabbit quite a bit. So this is really, we feel we can make rigorous inferences beyond this individual to Western Clovis as a whole.
Hmm.